Sergeant Eva Rostova was a creature of the earth, not the air. Her world was the tarmac of Crestwood Air Force Base, a small, dusty outpost tucked into the plains of eastern Colorado. She knew the belly of every jet like the back of her own hand. The cold metal, the intricate wiring, the deep guttural hum of an engine as it roared to life. She was an aircraft mechanic, one of the best. Her hands, calloused and strong, could diagnose a problem with a single touch, feeling a vibration others would miss. She had a quiet reputation for being able to fix anything, a woman of few words but immense competence. But on Crestwood Air Force Base, a mechanic was just that, a cog in the machine, a name on a checklist. The true heroes were the pilots, the men who strapped themselves into the cockpits, a world away from the grease and grit. This unwritten rule was enforced daily by Major Caldwell, the base's new chief of maintenance. He was a man who saw the world in strict hierarchies, and in his mind, Ava's place was firmly on the ground. The disrespect was subtle at first. He would address her male colleagues by their first names while calling her Sergeant Rostova with an air of distant formality. He would dismiss her suggestions in meetings, then a week later, present her ideas as his own. Eva bore it all with a quiet dignity that only seemed to infuriate him more. She held her head high, her dark eyes filled with a resolve that he mistook for stubbornness. She was a soldier, and a soldier followed orders. But she was also a woman who had fought for everything she had, and she wasn't about to be broken by a man who saw her as less. The insults grew sharper, more public. One hot afternoon during a routine safety inspection, Major Caldwell stopped in front of the crew. He had a tight, cruel smile on his face as he looked at Ava. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I heard you fixed the hydraulics on the F-15 in record time. Excellent work. It's always good to see. The ground crew's keeping up with the real heroes in the sky, isn't it?" He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. The other mechanics shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. Ava simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She knew what he was doing. He was reminding her of her place, of the invisible wall between those who fixed the planes and those who flew them. That evening, Ava found her solace. Tucked away in the back of an old, abandoned hangar, gathering dust since the squadron it belonged to had been decommissioned, sat a flight simulator. It was a relic, a gray metal box with a cracked plastic, windshield, and a seat that smelled of old leather and forgotten missions. Ava had discovered it her first week on base, and it had become her secret world. She had spent a year on her own time, painstakingly repairing its electrical wiring and calibrating its old controls. Now it was her sanctuary. She climbed into the seat and put on the worn helmet. The old screen flickered to life, showing a digital blue sky. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the feel of the controls settle in her hands. She knew every button, every dial, every procedure. She had studied the flight manuals for fun, poring over them late into the night. In this broken-down box, she was no longer a mechanic. She was a pilot. She was in the sky, soaring above the plains, the world a peaceful patchwork of brown and green below. She felt the weight of her uniform lift, the sting of Major Caldwell's words fade. She flew for hours that night, executing impossible maneuvers, running through emergency drills. She imagined the roar of the engines, the rush of the wind, the feel of the plane as it responded to her commands. It was a dream, a secret she had, held close since she was a little girl watching the planes fly over her grandfather's farm. She had wanted to fly, but the military had steered her toward what they called a more practical path for a young woman. So she had learned to fix the planes, to love the steel and the engines, but she had never stopped looking at the sky. When she finally climbed out of the simulator, the hangar was dark and silent. The moon shone through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. She felt a familiar emptiness, the return to her reality on the ground. She knew her place. She knew what people thought of her, a good mechanic, a strong soldier. but never, ever, a pilot. As she walked back to her barracks, she didn't know it yet, but a strange and dangerous twist of fate was waiting for her, a decision that would change her life forever. The morning sun beat down on the tarmac, already baking the asphalt. The mood was tense. Today was the day of the test flight for the new prototype fighter jet, the Sparrowhawk. It was a high-stakes mission, a chance to show the brass back in Washington that Crestwood was more than just a forgotten post. The test pilot, Lieutenant Jensen, was a gifted flyer, but he had called in sick with a high fever just an hour before takeoff. Panic was setting in. Major Caldwell was pacing in the command center, his face a mask of furious anxiety. "Find me a pilot now!" he barked at a young airman. The problem was Crestwood was a small training base. They didn't have a full squadron of pilots on standby. The only other qualified pilot was on leave in Denver, a 3-hour drive away. The window for the test flight was closing fast. That's when the news came in. A critical engine part had been found to be defective. A new one was waiting at the supply depot in a nearby town, but the delivery truck was stuck in traffic 100 miles away. The flight could not proceed without it. Caldwell put his head in his hands. "This is a disaster," he muttered. He was more concerned with the failure reflecting on him than the mission itself. Eva was in the hangar, overseeing the final checks, when she heard the news. She listened, her mind racing. She knew the Sparrowhawk better than anyone on the ground crew. She had helped build it piece by piece. She had run the diagnostics. She knew every quirk, every noise, every little thing that made it special. And she knew it could fly. She had flown it 100 times in the old simulator. She had read the flight manuals until she knew them by heart. She knew its takeoff procedures, its systems, its limits. A dangerous thought, a crazy, impossible idea began to form in her mind. It was reckless, treasonous, a violation of every military code she had ever sworn to uphold. But she also knew that if that mission failed, it could mean the end of her base, the end of her career, and a huge setback for the entire Air Force. And in that moment, she was more a soldier than a mechanic. She was someone who solved problems. She slipped away from the crew, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the key to the flight hangar in a lockbox where a forgetful junior officer had left it. She walked into the private pilot's locker room, her hands shaking slightly. It was a sacred space off-limits to ground crews. She grabbed an old flight suit and helmet, feeling like a thief. She changed quickly, the familiar fabric feeling foreign and thrilling at the same time. She knew she was crossing a line she could never uncross. As she made her way to the jet, she passed a nervous young Private Miller, who was new to the base. He saw a figure in a flight suit, but the helmet hid her face. He saluted, a quick, uncertain gesture. Ava nodded in return, her heart thumping against her ribs. He was too junior and too intimidated to ask a pilot what they were doing without a full crew. He had no idea he was looking at Sergeant Rostova. She climbed into the cockpit, the scent of new plastic and polished metal filling her lungs. It felt so much bigger, so much more real than the simulator. She went through the pre-flight checks, a practiced routine she had memorized from the manuals. Her hands moved with a calm confidence that surprised even her. She radioed the tower using a generic call sign she had made up in her head. Pegasus 1, requesting takeoff clearance. The tower operator, flustered by the chaos of the morning, gave her clearance without a second thought. Assuming a pilot from another base had been flown in for the emergency, the Sparrowhawk roared to life, a magnificent beast of steel and fire. The jet trembled, the engine's deep sound vibrating through the seat. Eva pushed the throttle forward and the runway began to rush past her. She pulled back on the stick and the ground fell away. She was in the sky. She felt a mix of pure, unadulterated joy and a deep, gnawing fear. She knew that as soon as she landed, her life was over. She would be a criminal, a thief, a disgrace. She flew low and fast, her mind focused only on the mission. She picked up the engine part at the supply depot and was back at the base in a fraction of the time it would have taken a truck. She was about to land when the base tower operator radioed her, his voice full of confusion. "Pegasus 1, we have a security team waiting for you. Please proceed to the main hangar immediately." A chill ran down her spine. The tower had finally figured it out. As she taxied the jet, she saw the security Humvees waiting. She cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening. She took off the helmet, letting her long, dark hair fall free. The security commander, a stout man with a stern face, looked at her in disbelief. He had been expecting an officer, a male pilot. He stared at her, then at the sergeant's stripes on her sleeve. "You're under arrest, Sergeant," he said, his voice flat. "For grand theft and for impersonating an officer." Eva looked him straight in the eyes, her expression calm. The test flight was saved, the mission a success. She had done her duty. But she had also lost everything. The military courthouse was a stark, unforgiving room. The walls were a sterile white, and the air was thin and cold. Eva sat at a heavy wooden table, her hands clasped in her lap. She was no longer wearing her uniform, but a simple dark blue jumpsuit of the military brig. Her face was pale, but her eyes held the same steady resolve they always had. Across the room sat Major Caldwell, the lead prosecutor in her case. He was dressed in his finest dress uniform, a man playing a part, and a part he clearly enjoyed. He looked at her not with anger, but with a smug, knowing smile. He had her. Her lawyer, a young, earnest public defender named Lieutenant Clark, whispered to her, "I'm sorry, Sergeant. This is bad. They are not looking at this as an act of saving the mission. They are treating it as a theft." Eva simply nodded. She had expected this. She knew that Caldwell would twist her actions. He wouldn't see her bravery. He would see a threat to his authority. The trial was a show. Caldwell called one witness after another. The first was the tower operator, a nervous young man who stammered as he described how a mysterious pilot had taken off. Caldwell made him look like an idiot, as if he should have known something was wrong. Then came Private Miller, the airman Eva had passed on her way to the hangar. He looked terrified. Caldwell's questions were a trap. "Did you see this individual's face, Private?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Miller shook his head. "No, sir." "They had a helmet on." Caldwell smiled. "But you could tell, couldn't you, that they were moving like a professional? A pilot, perhaps? Not a confused mechanic?" Miller hesitated, his eyes darting to Eva, then back to Caldwell. He was a good kid, but he was scared. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "They moved like a professional." Caldwell pointed a finger at Eva. "This is a woman who, driven by ambition she had no right to have, broke every rule in the book. She stole military property, she impersonated a pilot, and she put the lives of others at risk." He painted a picture of a dangerous, reckless woman who had no respect for the chain of command. He made her seem like a wild animal that had to be caged. He even brought up her past. He had a file detailing her childhood, how she grew up poor, an orphan living with her grandparents. He used it to suggest a history of rebellion and a lack of proper upbringing. "A soldier, my lord, must have a stable mind, a stable background. We must have men and women we can trust to follow orders. Sergeant Rostova has proven she cannot." Eva listened to it all, the lies, the half-truths, the insults. She felt her heart ache with the injustice of it all. She had saved the mission, but they were pretending it never happened. They were more concerned with the rules she had broken than the service she had given. Lieutenant Clark, her lawyer, did his best. He argued that Eva's actions, while unorthodox, were selfless. He brought up the successful test flight, the fact that the mission was saved because of her quick thinking. But Caldwell had an answer for everything. "The mission was not saved by a rogue operator, Lieutenant," he said. "It was saved because we had a backup plan. The truck was on its way. Sergeant Rostova's actions were unnecessary, and they were a danger." It was a lie, but no one could prove it. The judges looked at Eva with a mix of pity and sternness. She knew what they were thinking, a good kid who had made a terrible mistake. They didn't see the brave soldier who had risked her life for a mission. They saw a criminal. They saw a woman who had dared to step out of her place. Finally, the verdict came down. It was swift and final. "Guilty," the lead judge said, his voice ringing with authority. "Guilty on all counts." The sentence was a year in the brig and a dishonorable discharge. Eva's world shattered. A dishonorable discharge meant an end to everything she had worked for. No military pension, no veterans' benefits. Her entire life, everything she had sacrificed was gone. She was led away, Her head held high, but inside she was broken. She had done the right thing, and she was being punished for it. She was no longer a soldier. She was a prisoner. She was no longer a hero. She was a disgrace. The first few months in the brig were a gray blur of routine and regret. Ava kept to herself, her mind a fortress against the shame and the cold reality of her new life. She didn't speak about the past. She did her time, scrubbing floors, folding laundry, a good soldier even in captivity. The other prisoners knew her story. They saw a woman who had tried to do something big and had failed. They saw a pilot who had gotten caught. She had earned a strange kind of respect, not for what she had done, but for her quiet endurance in the face of injustice. She was no longer Sergeant Rostova. She was the pilot to them. One day, a legend came to Crestwood Air Force Base. General Thompson, a retired decorated pilot from the old days, was on a tour of small bases. He was a man of immense reputation and quiet dignity. He was tall and weathered, with a shock of white hair and a kind face that held the memory of 100 battles and 1,000 sunsets in the sky. He had a habit of talking to everyone from the highest-ranking officer to the lowest-ranking private. He saw the heart of a base not in its planes, but in its people. After a morning of inspections, General Thompson was having lunch with Major Caldwell. The general's mind was still on the test flight he had heard so much about. "That Sparrowhawk is a fine-looking machine, Major," he said. "I heard you had a little snafu with it. Something about a rogue pilot?" Caldwell laughed dismissively. "Oh, that? Just some overzealous mechanic. She's in the brig now. A good lesson in respecting the chain of command." The general's eyes narrowed. "I'd like to see the flight data if you don't mind. I'm a bit of a data junkie." Caldwell's smile wavered for a moment. He didn't want the general looking at the messy details, but he had no choice. He sent a junior officer to retrieve the flight data logs from the Sparrowhawk's test flight. A few minutes later, the data was up on a screen. General Thompson leaned in, his face serious. He wasn't looking at the flight path. He was looking at the technical details. The perfect speed, the steady altitude, the smooth, graceful turns. It was a flawless flight. Then he noticed a tiny detail in the report. The pilot's call sign, the one they had made up on the fly, Pegasus 1. The general's heart skipped a beat. Decades ago, during a secret, dangerous mission, his own personal call sign had been a numerical sequence that, when translated, was Pegasus 1. The sequence was not public knowledge. No one would have known it, unless they had been a pilot who had studied the old war histories, the old pilots and their flights. The general knew with a certainty that could not be shaken that the pilot who flew that plane was not some novice. They were a pilot, a good one, and somehow they knew about him. He excused himself from the lunch and went straight to the brig. He told the guard that he was there to see the pilot. He was a general, and generals did not have to explain themselves. Eva was led into a small, sterile room. She stood at attention, her back straight, her face a mask of polite indifference. "At ease, Sergeant," the general said softly. He looked at her not with judgment, but with respect. He didn't ask her about the flight. He asked her about the planes, about her life, about her dreams. He saw her love for the aircraft, her deep understanding of the engines. He saw the sadness in her eyes and the strength in her spine. He saw a person who had been broken, but not defeated. He saw the same fire in her eyes that he had seen in the eyes of the young pilots he had trained so long ago. Then he asked a simple question, a question no one else had thought to ask. "Why did you do it, Sergeant? Why did you risk everything for one flight?" Eva's gaze met his. Her voice was a soft whisper, but it was filled with emotion. "It was the mission, General. The mission was going to fail. We would have lost a lot more than a test flight." The general nodded slowly. He understood. He had made 1,000 decisions just like that one in his life. He looked at her and knew the truth. This wasn't a criminal. This was a hero. And he knew what he had to do. He left the brig without a word, but in his mind he had already started a chain of events that would turn the entire base on its head. The day of Ava's release from the brig was a dreary one, the sky a dull gray. She was led out into the open air and taken to the main parade ground. A large crowd had gathered, a mix of officers and enlisted personnel. Major Caldwell stood at the front, his chest puffed out, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The public ceremony was to be a final spectacle, a way to show everyone what happened to a soldier who went against the rules. They would read her dishonorable discharge and send her on her way, a lesson for all to see. A senior officer began to read from a prepared statement. His voice was flat and official. Sergeant Eva Rostova, for the crimes of grand theft of military property and impersonating a pilot, will be dishonorably discharged from the United States Air Force with immediate effect. Eva stood straight, her chin held high, ready for the final humiliation. She had done her time. She had faced her punishment. She was ready to face the world as a disgraced soldier. Just as the officer was about to continue, a clear, authoritative voice cut him off. "At ease, Lieutenant." The crowd turned to see General Thompson walking toward the podium. He had arrived just moments before in a military transport. He was followed by a stern-faced, decorated officer in a crisp uniform, the squadron commander of the base, a man who had been away on special assignment and had just been briefed. Caldwell's face went pale. He knew he was in deep trouble. The squadron commander stepped up to the microphone. "Major Caldwell," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving, "you failed to brief me on a number of critical events. For one, you failed to inform me that we had a mission failure on our hands due to your lack of a backup plan. You also failed to mention that a brave and selfless soldier, Sergeant Rostova, took it upon herself to correct your mistake. She saved the mission. Her actions, while a violation of procedure, were the actions of a true patriot and a pilot of immense skill." The crowd began to murmur. Caldwell's face was a mask of furious disbelief. The squadron commander turned to him. "Major Caldwell, you deliberately chose to cover up your incompetence and let a good soldier take the fall. Your actions are dishonorable and a disgrace to this base. You are hereby relieved of your command. Security, escort Major Caldwell off the premises." 2 military police officers stepped forward and, to the stunned silence of the crowd, led Caldwell away. He cast one last hateful look at Eva, who simply looked ahead, her heart pounding with a strange mix of relief and shock. Then, the squadron commander turned back to Eva. He held up a different document. "Sergeant Rostova, this is not a dishonorable discharge. It is an official citation for bravery. Effective immediately, you are hereby promoted to the rank of officer candidate. You will report to officer training school in 2 weeks. The Air Force does not lose brave soldiers. It rewards them." Eva's breath caught in her throat. She felt tears welling in her eyes, tears she hadn't shed since her conviction. She was no longer a criminal. She was a hero. Her bravery, her sacrifice, had not been in vain. Her journey had not ended in disgrace, but in justice. The crowd began to cheer, a wave of relief and admiration sweeping across the parade ground. The junior officers, the enlisted men, the mechanics, they all looked at her with new eyes, no longer seeing a disgrace, but a hero. The squadron commander walked toward her, his face a mixture of respect and gratitude. He stopped in front of her. In a silent, powerful, and deeply meaningful gesture, he lifted his hand to his brow and saluted. He was a decorated officer, a war hero, and he was saluting a mechanic who had been in the brig. Eva, her spine straight and her chin held high, her eyes shining with tears of vindication, returned the salute. It was no longer the empty formality of a soldier to a superior. It was the salute of one pilot to another. She was free. She was honored. And in 2 weeks she would finally be where she was always meant to be, in the sky.